Coming to you from Boise, Idaho, the fastest growing city in the U.S. and recognized as one of the most creative and vibrant cities to live in. This is a special edition of Enhancing the Human Experience, a World of Creativity, a series of unique interviews with successful people from around the globe, how they get inspired, where their ideas come from, and how they apply creativity in their business and personal lives. Now, here's your host, Mark Phillips, along with special guest interviewer, Mark Stinson.
Welcome to another episode of A World of Creativity, this special series inside Enhancing the Human Experience. I'm Mark Phillips. Mark, welcome.
I'm Mark Stinson, and we have a terrific interview today. And thinking about this idea of a world of creativity, I think there's a nice double meaning to that. You know, certainly the world, there's global thinking, global exchange of ideas and such, but it's also the breadth of creativity in terms of, how many things can you get involved in? How many things do you work on? How many experiences do we have to apply our creative thinking? And our guest today on the episode just epitomizes that. And we want to welcome Kevin Fox. Kevin, welcome to the interview.
Well, hello, Mark and Mark. Thanks for having me.
Hey, it does make it simple to know who to call out there when we're both named Mark. But Kevin is running an enterprise now called Foxworks, and it's a real creative boutique kind of approach. I'm sure he'll tell us more about it as we go. But what I like about what Kevin's doing is really putting that sweat equity. I met Kevin when we were both working with a global communications agency concern. So, having that international breadth, but being able now to sort of break away from the mothership, if I could say that, to say, let's do it a little bit differently. Let's think about it independently. So that's what I like about what Kevin's doing. And we've shared some of those experiences in our career as well. But Kevin, as we get going, I would be interested to know, when we say a world of creativity, what sort of international project? You've lived in Toronto, you live in Columbus now. What other places and projects have you worked on that, allow you to tap into that international sense of creativity?
Well, that's a great question. I think, it's been interesting to see when I first moved to Canada, I'll be honest, I fell into this belief that how different can it really be? Right? It's just a little bit up north. It's America's hat, as we used to like to say. But I was blown away actually culturally how different Toronto was from the States. Not to mention then how different Montreal was from Toronto. In my time in Canada, I was overseeing the creative departments for both a Toronto office and a Montreal office. And the stark differences between culture in those spaces was really impressive and really interesting. And they had very, very different problems to solve. And when I look at creativity and I look at what we do, that's the way I frame what we do. We solve business problems through creativity. And yes, it may end up being a TV spot or a website or a marketing campaign online or, podcast, but what it begins as is a solution to a business problem. And it was interesting. One, the business problems were very different from the States to Toronto to Montreal, but then how you had to approach solving them was even more different. Just the individual personalities of the offices, the constructs, the local cultural norms, just very, very different approaches. And it was interesting because it influenced the work. While we had processes, like you mentioned, Mark, this was a giant global communications company, but the personnel, we all know that in advertising and in creative departments in particular, your product is your people. And those people with those disparate personalities influenced the work to such a great degree. It didn't matter that we were putting the same processes on the work. It still had a different flavor. And it was important to reflect that local flavor in those different offices. So I think it was really interesting to see those cultural differences and how to, one, maximize them, but get the benefit from them, but also be able to get them to communicate with one another. Because actually some of those cultural differences, they're at odds with one another. And when you're working, trying to create one singular communications firm, you need to have some common ground for us all to speak to. So again, culture and the local perspectives. It was a really interesting challenge beyond going in and breaking an agency down and putting in new processes and new creative expectations. That I knew I was getting into. But dealing with the individual cultural differences was a surprise, and probably one of the more exciting portions of that.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you say this, because clearly now, we realize the importance more than ever of diversity, and in this case, we don't just mean diversity of race, creed, citizenship, and so forth, but also diversity of experience, diversity of point of view.
Mm-hmm.
How did you find, when you're saying that kind of disparate, but having different people look at a problem, a business problem, in so many different ways? What were the pluses and minuses of that?
Well, it's interesting. I think there's nothing but positive that comes out of it as long as you put the right guardrails in front of it ahead of time. And that was my biggest learning, is to put I want to give guardrails, not handcuffs, when I'm working with a creative team and we're solving a creative problem.
That's an interesting difference.
Yeah. You want them to be free, but understand that we are solving a problem and there is a box. We can color outside the lines, fantastic, but know that there is a box for this problem to be solved within. And as long as you put those guardrails in there properly, and that starts with obviously a solid creative brief that people can execute off of, but also your creative expectations and process, and making sure you're staying on top of it from a creative director perspective. And as long as you have that, these disparate point of views are nothing but positive fuel. And I'll tell you what, there's nothing that will kill creative energy faster than having a whole group of people in a room agreeing with each other. There's nothing good that comes from that. That I would much rather have vehement disagreements. Let's be polite, right? Let's respect one another, but let's have very vehemently disagree on points of view. And you know what, Mark, in our time together, we had some pretty vehement disagreements.
Well, I was having some flashback moments on Throwback Thursday here, but no, but I think you're saying the right thing, is that, respect being what it is, and saying, hey, you're coming from a different point of view, but you're right. What if we all thought the same thing? First of all, the meeting would last 5 minutes, but what would we possibly accomplish?
Right. Yeah. I think that there are some folks who they like to structure their departments and their agencies, and they want to structure them with sycophantic head bobbers, and those aren't the type of agencies that I want to be a part of. That's not the kind of environment I want to work in.
Let's all get along is one thing.
Or I'll tell you what you're going to think, and you just reflect it back to me, right?
Well, that's a good point. And I think, Kevin, have you had the situation where, whether it be a client or whether it be, a creative director kind of above your level, say, yes, I'm open to your ideas, and here's what I'm open to.
Right.
Right.
How do you deal with that?
Well, I know that, I feel that I may deal with it a little bit more as a lead creative director than some other folks have in my past. I've had some wonderful creative directors and mentors in my career, and I felt like the ones I learned the most from would, one, allow me to push back and think freely and bring my point of view to things, but also say, okay, that's great, but here's what we're going to do with that point of view. We're going to carve off these edges and we're going to use this, right? But never in my experience did I have, I didn't have good experiences when I wasn't given that freedom to think and freedom to push back and freedom to say what if. And then as you progress through your career, I really think that you get to the point where you're too senior, you're paid too much money to say okay to everything, right? Your job really is to push back and to say what if, and to bring that new perspective. And I've had it in my career. I've had folks who reported to me that things were going very, very well. Very talented creatives who I liked personally, respected professionally, but we had a problem. They would always agree. And one in particular, a very, very close friend of mine, actually, who we worked on projects outside of the agency world together. And there was a point in time when he was reporting to me where it just seemed as though all of a sudden, now he's agreeing with everything I say. So I actually had to schedule a meeting and call him into my office and ask him to close the door and be very, very, very to the point and say, "Hey, man, this isn't working." And he said he didn't understand why. And I said, "Look, you're just agreeing with me all the time, and this is not how it ever worked with us. And that's why I was excited to work with him." And once we got that out and understood that, no, I'm expecting you to push back. When I'm solving problems, I'm no different. Just because I have a higher title, I'm in no different perspective than anyone else solving a problem. Once you start thinking about it, you get your nose is against the paper, right? Your nose is against the screen, the page. You're too close to it. So it's no matter where you are, where you're coming from. If you're down in the work trying to solve something, you need someone to keep you in check. And so I like surrounding myself with creatives who are talented, have strong points of view, and aren't afraid to say, "Yeah, but how about we think about it this way?"
Yeah, that's very good. Thinking about the people side of things, it is too cliche maybe to say, it's a people business and all our assets are the people that leave it, at the elevator. I was going to say leave at 5 o'clock, but what creative person ever leaves at 5 o'clock?
Exactly.
But, how do you assess that people part? Because certainly, creative people and look, it goes back to the painters of history and the writers of history. It's kind of a cantankerous bunch sometimes. But how do you balance that wow creative stuff with sometimes the personalities and the people that you're dealing with? How do you find that balance?
Well, I think that's a great question, and I really think that those those personalities, the cantankerous bunch, if you will, I feel like that is the lifeblood of a creative department, and I really believe that that cantankerous bunch is the lifeblood of the creative department, and uh, so often, and particularly when we get into these larger global communications concerns, we like to strip a lot of that away, right? We want to make sure that when we put these creatives in a room with a client, they're not going to say or do anything crazy, right? But yet, when we take them back to the creative floor and the clients aren't around, we want them to be thinking crazy and providing these amazing solutions. And I think that there's a balance, right? We all have to understand that we're in a business, right? We're in a service industry, and we have clients that we are serving and problems we're solving. And yes, you have to be professional and respectful and understand how to operate in a meeting. However, there's sometimes I feel like in some agencies and some spaces that starts to get, they like to round the edges off those creatives a little bit more than probably is beneficial to the end product. They maybe want them to kind of look and sound and dress a lot alike. And I think that becomes a problem. And quite frankly, the dressing differently, I've never been one of those creatives who actually like looks much like a creative as far as the way I dress, but in my own way, I felt like, well, that's my rebellion, right? I've got all, I went to art school and was surrounded by all these people with, facial piercings and tattoos on their, necks and, wearing whatever, crazy outfits. And, I was pretty, mainstream, I would say, by comparison. But in a way, that was my way of rebelling, because I looked at that and I said, well, you're all kind of starting to look alike, right? So, but it's important when you look into that, because clothing isn't my mode of expression, but it's many creatives' mode of expression, and it's important to let them express themselves and feel comfortable and understand that because it may be wearing those, red Converse high tops with, a business suit is their way of remembering at the heart of everything they are a creative, and their job is to look at things a little differently. And the moment they lose that, or the moment they feel like they don't have permission to challenge something and look at things differently, their value as a creative is sunk. So however that expression finds itself, again, as long as it's rooted in respect, mutual respect for different departments, different skill sets, then I appreciate it and I encourage it. And many of my best creatives in my career have been those who some may have dubbed, quote, a problem. Right? They were maybe a little bit more challenging. They were maybe quote, management issue. Right? I had a lot of those in my world.
They were on a performance plan.
Yes, exactly. And
but it's funny you're describing these two business settings in a separate way. One is a client meeting. You're in the conference room. You're at the rosewood table, and the other is, quote, back at the shop. And I remember watching this National Geographic series on the creative genius. One was on Einstein and one was on Picasso. And I was reflecting on those settings. I was like, I'd never bring either one of those guys to a client meeting. And yet
Yeah.
Right.
that's the amazing creative genius,
Right.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
I think that's what you're describing, Kevin.
Yeah, certainly, certainly. And I
Yeah.
think, it's interesting because oftentimes a creative's, long-term career aspirations will hinge on their ability to get in front of clients. And that's one thing that I've shared a lot with many creatives, very, very talented creatives. You can be a fantastic creative and stay back at the shop and do great work. And trust me, there are plenty of people who will gladly go take credit for the work you're doing. That there's no
Isn't that
shortage.
that's the truth? Yeah.
There is no shortage of people who will go take credit for your great work. But if oftentimes the best way to proceed and progress in your career is to be a fantastic presenter. It's to
Mhm.
learn the language of presentation. It's to learn the language of a client meeting and how you read the room and feel the energy. And that is it's something that's learned. No one's born with that skill. But many times, especially a lot of really talented creatives who are maybe a little more introverted or a little bit, see the world differently, they feel intimidated by that moment, and getting them to get past that and just kind of jump in and feel their way through. It's another skill for them to learn, and it's incredibly important for them to learn it, to be able to be in front of those clients. And now you're a dual threat, right? Yeah, you can come up with great work, but also we can go in the client meeting and you can sell it. And I've always believed that the creatives in the creative department, and of course I'm biased, right? I'm a creative director, but I believe that the smartest people in an agency reside in the creative department. I think that they are extremely smart, especially Mark, when you look at a lot of the work that we had done in the past in these highly regulated industries. It's a lot of science to understand. There's a lot of background to get up to speed on very, very quickly, and you're jumping from project to project, having to get up to speed on different things. So I think that there's an innate desire or need to be curious and a quick learner and a quick study, and now translate into that to a business solution through creativity. And that's a skill set in its own. Now, when you can go in and now present your own work, that's incredibly beneficial, not only to the agency, but long-term career health and aspirations for that person, because now they're the ones getting credit for that work. And I think it's
Mhm.
really important for people not to overestimate the importance of learning to present and be comfortable in a client meeting.
Yeah.
That's really good. So as we think about the world of creativity, we think about the breadth of the applications of creativity, and the kind of accounts and business problems, whether it's in medical, like medical devices, or pharma brands. But you go on into banking, quick service restaurants, all manner of consumer products, food products, and so forth. What's been your experience as to the thread or the essence of the creative thinking, or that goes through all of those kinds of business situations?
That's a great question, and I think it's one that a lot of people, they struggle with because think about it. When clients are out there looking for agencies, the first thing they do is they send out an RFP, and they're looking for an agency that has experience in their vertical, in their category. And oftentimes, when agencies are looking to hire creatives or account folks or other folks to service in this client, they're looking for people with experience in that vertical, in that space. So, the first thing oftentimes clients will do, they send out an RFP and they're looking for agencies with experience in a particular vertical, experience in a particular category. And then when those agencies go to hire folks to service that business, they're looking for creatives with experience in that space and account folks with experience in that space. And it's not to discount the value of that. There's a lot of value in that. But to get to your question, there's a lot, creatives in particular, they're in this industry and they're in this business because they want to solve problems. And I think really that thread, whether you're working in pharma, biotech, financial services, whether you're in consumer packaged goods, selling fizzy drinks, cruise ships, it doesn't, I think about the all of the different spaces I've worked in my career. The common thread is you're solving business problems through creativity. And the people who are drawn to this industry like solving problems. And as long as you, again, are approaching each of these projects with that in mind, then you're going to find success. Does that mean there's going to be learnings in every new space, every new vertical you enter into? But again, being curious by nature helps a lot for creatives to get up to speed on these things. But
Mhm.
at the root of things, they need to understand their job is to solve business problems through creativity. And if they can do that, they can succeed in any category.
It sounds like what you're saying is that if the person has the I guess, like I said, the curiosity and the skill set, they can adapt and they can learn, because all that, knowing about a category or a vertical is a learning thing, right? And then you apply
Certainly.
your natural innate. That's really interesting.
Mhm.
And for you, Kevin, then do you feel like you have a go-to tool or method or process, in your quiver, that if somebody throws a business problem on your lap, you say, this is the first thing I'm going to do, and then this is the second. How do you approach it?
That's a good question. I think, I probably do have, I certainly have processes that I have generated, one for the agency itself, right? We have a creative process we undergo no matter what the client is. But I think that your bigger question probably is, what's my personal process, right? What's that
Yes,
first
yes.
thing that
What's
goes
your
through my mind?
creative approach?
And
Yes.
Mhm.
I think that's a lot more interesting because every agency has a process, right? Or at least they'll trot one out on some PowerPoint slides and a pitch. But that getting down to that, like, what's that first thing that goes through your mind as a creative? That's a really interesting thought. And I think I that's where I really think you start to see the differences in different creatives. And when you have a creative who may come from more of a copywriting background, they might be going to words and prose, and they might want to write out a story. You have an art director or a designer background creative, and they might want to go to telling that story visually and through graphics. And you have some folks who want to jump to a solution and go very tactical. I think in my career, I've been both an art director and a copywriter, and I think that has served me very, very well. But I think the first place I go is I go very logical. I go very strategic. And I think that I start to, if I don't have a creative brief in front of me initially that is giving me a problem to solve, I first create one. And you know what? This is actually, now that I'm talking this through, I think that this is a lot of times where you start to run into the quote cantankerous creatives, right? Let me just kind of share a scenario with you, right? We have a creative kickoff. There's a creative brief shared. This creative brief probably went through multiple rounds of revisions, had to get approved through the leadership of the agency, let alone the client, to where then they had to make their changes and add their mandatories. And by the time, oftentimes, that creative brief gets to a point where it's kicked off with a group of creatives, there's not much edge on it anymore. A lot of times, that's unfortunately what happens. They try to cram too much in. There's not a singular point of view, and quite frankly, they solve the problem in the brief. And when there's a brief that's unveiled in a creative kickoff, and there's no clear problem to solve, that's when you start to get the quote cantankerous creatives because they're going to start poking holes in it. They're going to start saying what if. They're going to start saying yeah, but, and they're going to say whoever wrote this brief doesn't know what they're doing. And you know what? Those are oftentimes the creatives I want on the business, because what they're doing, they're not trying to be jerks. They're trying to find a problem to solve. And if there's not one that's clearly outlined on the brief, you can damn well be sure they'll create one. And again, those are the creatives you want on that business. And so I think that's probably the first thing I do, is make sure that there is a clear problem to solve. And if there isn't, I'm going to create one. And I'm going to create a problem that's in line with the strategy. But I really think that's the first thing I do before I start thinking about solutions or tactics or anything else, is just, again, really defining what is the problem we're solving and who we're solving it for. And you can spend a lot of time thinking that through and slicing and dicing that in many different ways. And I think once you have a very clearly defined problem, the solutions, they come a lot easier. Because if you can blue sky it all day long, but without some guardrails, without a clear problem to solve, you're spending a lot of time on possibly great ideas that are not going to go anywhere. So why spend that energy there? Let's be a little bit more restrained early on to get the guardrails in place. It's like the Robert Frost quote, right? He said, free verse. He was talking about poetry, and he said, free verse is like playing tennis without a net. right? Like you can, okay, I can knock that ball back and forth all day long, but
That's
there's
right.
no
That would be
net.
my kind of tennis.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. What's the challenge in it? And that, guess what? There's not just a net. There's also out of bounds, right? So that box that adds to the excitement of the game, right? Without that moment of that out of bounds line, if we're watching Wimbledon and we're watching the super slow mo of that ball hitting on the outside of that line, is it in or is it out? Right? We would not have that dramatic moment that in the game, and that's what it comes down to, that tension. We're trying to find tension in our strategy. We're trying to create tension in our creative execution, because without tension, there's no momentum. And what we're really trying to do is create momentum, right? We're trying to create business change. We're trying to create behavior change. And in order to create change, you need tension to do that. And oftentimes, many briefs strip out that tension up front. So it's very, very important. The first thing to do is rediscover the tension and put it in there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, that's very good.
Wow.
So if we could turn the page now a little bit to the personal side, how you keep your own creative fires burning, your brain synapses firing. I got to say, one of the reasons I love following you on Instagram is that one moment you can be at a concert or at a kids museum or at a library or, your various travels. But where do you go for your own inspiration to keep things fresh?
Well, you just nailed a lot of them, right? I think
I'll go back and hear what I said.
Yeah, exactly. But I think music, live music in particular, is a great source of inspiration. Museums. My wife and I both, we are just museum junkies. We got married at the museum here in Columbus. That's
Wow.
that's to the extent that our love of arts and culture really permeate our relationship. And it's one thing that it's been a centering point on our agency as well. Community progress in advancing the art scene, and in Columbus, oftentimes in maybe underserved neighborhoods. There's a lot of great activities and great initiatives that we've been fortunate enough to be a part of, to be able to do that. And that's really because we do believe that arts portion is so critical to forming young minds and solving problems in this world, that increasingly is going to rely on creativity. If you look again at, I'm getting a little bit sidetracked here, but if you look again at the future of the work landscape with AI coming into the fold, and robotics and the jobs that are going to be at risk. The thing that's toughest for AI to duplicate is creativity. And it's because it's really messy. It's a really messy proposition. And then my goal, in my creative teams and when I work, is try to harness that messiness and that creativity and streamline it and put it on the right path so you can harness that creative, chaotic energy towards an end goal. But you know what? AI and robotics and computers have a difficult time being messy. So I really believe the future for our working class and our problem solvers in the future and our creatives of the future, I think is very bright. I think as long as we can achieve solve problems through creativity. So I think the arts programs are really important to do. It's unfortunate that oftentimes arts and music are many of the first things that get cut when there's budget issues. And I think that it's just important to spend our energy and our time there and understand the benefit, both in the long term for the health of our people and our young people, but also economically. I read a study recently, and I can't remember where it was. I wish I could for your podcast, but it talked about the economic impact of the arts and how many billions of dollars the arts brings into the economy of the United States. And fantastic article. But just really reframes how you look at that. And when you look at, from even an urban development perspective, when there's moments where there may be some sketchy areas where retail doesn't want to go, where people aren't traveling anymore, who goes there? The artists go there. And what do they do? They make it cool. And once the artists make it cool, and then the capitalists come in and the artists get pushed out and they have to go make somewhere else cool. But now they've been a spark to that growth. And that's just a small example of the hidden value of creativity and the hidden value of creativity.
No, that's so good. I heard a developer talk about following the hipsters. It's like wherever they are, that's where it's going.
Trend,
yeah,
right?
exactly. It's absolutely
I wanted to drill down on what you were talking about. The arts, but the culture and the in Columbus. We've been fortunate in this podcast series to talk to, a couple of people, for example, in Paris and Madrid. I mean, these are cities you think about history and art and so forth. But then also Austin, obviously has a amazing music scene. Delhi in India, the colors and the spices and the flavors and you can just hear it and feel it. But I think about, we live in Boise, Idaho, for goodness sake. Not a arts mecca, but the outdoors and the mountains are kind of our inspiration. But I think about Columbus and what you're saying. What role does that community creativity play in raising up the whole creative energy of the city, whether you're in the creative field or manufacturing or business or anything else? What role do you feel that plays?
Well, I think it plays a huge role, and I think that in Columbus in particular, we are really fortunate to have a thriving art scene and music scene, and a lot of folks who are helping to support that. Like you're not going to have a thriving music scene if people aren't going to see shows, right? And you aren't going to have a thriving art scene if people aren't seeing and buying original art. And we're fortunate that we have that happening here. We have a lot. Just the energy alone of the city is fantastic. There's a very young entrepreneurial spirit that permeates Columbus. A lot of people know Columbus as test market USA, right? So for many years, products would come here to be test marketed because it was such
because it's so normal,
right? Exactly, right. And I think
so average.
In many ways, I'm proud to say that we're losing our grip on that. Because I think we're becoming less average, and I think that a big spark of that really comes from the creative community. When you look at the educational institutions here, obviously you can't forget about Ohio State. Being a big anchor here, a lot of young folks coming in. One of the largest universities in the world, right? And people coming in from all around the world to attend that school, and they get unleashed into the workplace here. They stay and they create businesses and they inject their culture from wherever they came from. And so there's a really fantastic energy that comes with that. And then we have the arts. We have folks who are patrons of the arts. We have a client, actually the Johnstone Fund. The Johnstone Fund for New Music is a client of ours who they actually fund the creation of brand new classical music pieces. Now, when you think back to to Mozart, to the Salieri days of where people are commissioning these great masters to create the music now that we just think, well, that's what you hear on the classical music station, right? Well, someone commissioned that work. And so for so long, we've been hearing the same classical music. Well, the Johnstone Fund's very singular purpose is to create new classical music. And it's new music. It's a new style. It's a new approach. And some of it's actually very challenging to hear and understand. And then some of it is a little bit more in the basic classical genre. But what you get, if you go to one of these performances, you get inspired because you're hearing something you've never heard before. And again, that comes from patrons, right? That doesn't happen just getting. And so what they're able to do is they bring in composers and musicians from all around the world. Many of them happen to come from Brooklyn, but they have Columbus ties, so they come back and they create this amazing work. That's just an example that a lot of people don't even know about that's happening. That increases that creative energy of the space. When I talk about the creative energy that's happening downtown in our Franklinton area, which was an area, it used to be called the Bottoms, right? It was an area that no one would go to, but now there's this creative resurgence happening there. We have creative studios, design studios, we have welding studios, we have, imagine every creative outlet is happening down in that space, and it's amazing the energy it's providing, and the revenue it's bringing in, and the opportunities for the creative class in that downtown area. And when again look at all these moments where you can do it, right? One thing that's great about Columbus, this is something that, my wife, Alex, who is also a partner in our agency, she's always been very, very involved in community. She's always given back. She's always been involved. And when we lived in Toronto, it was no different. She jumped in and she wanted to be a part of the theater and art scene and music scene and jump in and help out with things. And she did that. But she also found it's a lot harder. That's a gigantic city with an established, kind of hierarchy, if you will. When you're in a space like Columbus, as much as it's a thriving arts community, if you want to get in and be involved, you can. And you can jump in and make a difference, and a great example of that is, we used to live in the Victorian Village area, which is an urban space it's called the Short North, in Columbus. It's a very artsy, lots of art galleries and restaurants and retail. It's right near our downtown area. They had in the park, we have a beautiful park called Goodale Park. And for many, many years, there was jazz in the park on Sundays. And this is another moment where, budgets weren't looking good. The sponsorships didn't happen any longer. So there was no longer jazz in the park on Sundays. And it was such a magical thing to see every Sunday, just people out on blankets listening to live jazz. And Alex, being a huge music lover and community advocate, said, well, we can't let the music stop. And so she created the Goodale Park Music Series. And she did that on her own without any sponsorships and foundations, but she pulled together business resources and networking that she had done to make this happen. And it's still going strong. It's been going on for over 10 years now. And it's a part of the fabric of the community. And it's something that people look to it for every summer on Sundays. And it's exciting to see how, again, that brings people together. And, not just music, but now there's food trucks that come involved and people with crafts. And, it's a good, again, that creative energy that the arts can create, and the sense of community that the arts can create, the sense of belonging that the arts can create.
Fantastic story. Yeah, fantastic. And it's interesting to connect the dots to what you were saying before about, a creative person's ability to both, come up with ideas and be inspired, but also then present the idea, sell the idea. You think about, Mozart, you think about Monet, Michelangelo, had to sell the idea to get the money, right?
Right.
Somebody's got to pay for the paint that's going to go on the Sistine Chapel. And for my time, because it's all. I also wanted to see Mozart's timesheet. How long did it take him to do that?
Oh my goodness!
Yeah,
chills there, Mark.
Yeah, that's right. But the idea that you do have to appreciate the word you use, patron. It's not just a funder. It's not just a client, who paid for something, but a patron sounds so much more like a creative supporter and a. That it's they're infusing some of their energy. They may not be able to write the music or compose the music or perform the music, but they love it and they're inspired by it. So therefore they'll, put their energy and support behind it. Well, what a terrific conversation. We really appreciate your time, Kevin. As we close, I guess if you could summarize, the source of this creative thinking and how you see things, changing going forward. How can we all be more creative? How can we support each other across borders? This world of creativity idea. How do we see the world being more open to creative ideas? What's your vision going forward?
Well, I think, first and foremost, in order to create things, you need to, start over. I think first and foremost, in order to be creative, you need to consume creative, right? So I think you need to read, right? Read novels, read graphic novels, comic books. I don't care what is your thing, but get the input in, whether it comes through reading or it comes through music, live music, which is a very different thing to listening to music on a CD or on a vinyl. The experience of artists creating something live in front of you. There's a different energy there. But again, in order to create it, you need to consume it. So get out there, go to the museum, get the inspiration, watch the great films that, they might be black and white. That's okay. There's learning to be had there. And I think that we all have seen over time that, great creatives, whether they be musicians, whether they be film directors, whether they be writers, they were inspired by those who came before them. They did not just drop out of the womb into the world and they were, instant masters. They worked on their craft and they consumed creative. So they had the fuel to now create juxtapositions, right? To create something that's a bit of inspiration from a movie they saw 30 years ago and combine that with a song they heard just last week and with an idea they had in the shower. And now you have a brand new thing, right? But they didn't come up with this brand new entity all on their own, fully baked. It was fueled by the creative they were consuming. And I do think that at the end of the day, that's where the creativity, a lot of that creativity comes from, is from consuming other great creative.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah, well,
Yeah,
thanks
insightful.
for those thoughts.
Yeah. All right. Well, so Kevin, we want to thank you for joining us. And before we wrap up, we love to ask our guests, do you have a favorite book you've read that's, fueled your own journey, or a podcast you're listening to, or current or in the past, something you can share a resource with the listeners?
Boy, that's a great question. So there's several resources, and I bounce around. I'm always trying to, kind of take in what I can when I can. I think Luke Sullivan, I really love to follow his exploits. As we all know, Luke Sullivan from the great book, Hey Whipple Squeeze This. I still like to follow his blog and see what he's got going on. There's, what I like to really kind of bounce around. There's several creative blogs I'll listen to and watch. But where I find that those are great, right? As a creative in this industry, I like to hear what else other creatives are doing in this industry, and you can't devalue its importance. Again, that's another bit of that fuel, right? That consuming. But I also think it's important to go outside of your industry, right? And outside of what business you're in, and find inspiration there as well. That's why I think it's just as important, to be reading, you might be reading a book today on digital marketing analytics, right? But hopefully next week you're reading a great fiction novel by some author who's writing their first book ever, right? Because it speaks to you in a new way. And I really think that it's that balance of inspiration from within your industry and outside your industry, which is where those real new, fresh ideas come. I think it's always great to get inspired and either be kind of, yep, I'm on the right track because this person I respect is doing the same thing I'm doing, or, oh, they're making me think about something differently. But I think the breakthrough ideas, right, the moonshot ideas, those ideas that are taking people by surprise, are ideas that are, again, maybe it's a little bit of an idea that I grabbed from your podcast, Mark, and then I'm going to merge that with an idea from, this novel I'm reading, or this song I heard made me think about something differently. So maybe that's a little esoteric, but I really believe that that's where, for me, that's where my creativity comes from. It's really that combination of sources and putting together in new ways.
Yeah, we definitely appreciate that. That's very helpful to hear. Well, thank you again, Kevin. We appreciate having you on and share your process and your work. We appreciate it.
Well, thank you guys very much.
Wow, what a great interview that was. Mark, Kevin Fox shared a lot of goodness with us in that episode, didn't he?
Well, he did. And, now we recorded that. We were lucky enough to talk with him a couple of weeks ago. Now that we have a chance to reflect on some of the ideas that he shared, and plus, what really comes across is a passionate, creative individual. And, he's not one of those loud, boisterous, hand-waving kind of creative people, but rather, one where the river runs deep. He's got a lot of passion behind the ideas, and and I loved a couple of the points he made. I mean, one was that we've heard from other guests too, but this idea that creativity is facilitated when you're really focused on solving a business problem. And then if you get the definition of the problem right, and he, in his world, the creative brief, get that right, and it really helps zero in on some of the creative solutions.
Yeah, I agree. And that seems to be a common theme that a lot of our creatives have talked about, knowing what the outcome they want is and the solution they're looking for before they even start.
Yeah, and particularly, as a quote or a soundbite or a takeaway, this idea that this direction or this brief is not meant to be handcuffs. There might be guardrails and guidance, but it's certainly not something that handcuffs your creative thinking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. He brought up a lot of interesting ideas. I was really fascinated when he was talking about the research that has been done on how much of an economic impact, positive economic impact, the creatives have, whether they're artists or whether they're coming in and revitalizing downtrodden neighborhoods and bringing, economic prosperity and cool restaurants and events and things like that, that then get kind of folded into the general economic environment of a city. I think people don't think of that and don't see that. It was fascinating.
Yeah, I think what he was talking about is building these economies around a real creative culture and community building. In fact, the story you told about the nonprofit that reaches out and tries to explore and identify young up and coming musicians, particularly classical musicians, is an example of how this creative community gets built, where the it's almost like in the days of Michelangelo and others. You get the patrons of the arts, and that's what these people are creating in modern times.
Yeah, I definitely got that sense. He definitely has his finger on the pulse of what's happening there, and then translating that into making the economy stronger in these cities. It was really interesting talking with him.
Yeah, and there'll be some great reading in the show notes. Find those links. Look into this more. So, as an active listener to our podcast, I'm sure folks will want to go and dig into those more.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I'll include those in the show notes. And, like we've mentioned before, the interview is kind of just the starting point. And then there's so much that they're sharing with us that folks can travel down and research more on their own, which I think is great in the form of, books or different podcasts or what's inspiring them. That's what's been another awesome experience here, having these folks share the resources they use, so we can fold them into our bag of tools.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what you're talking about, this thread that goes through all the podcasts, if you haven't had a chance, folks, to go back and listen to the other interviews that we've conducted, I think our first one was Sherry Talley, go back to the beginning and hear this thread of, creative problem solving. And I think that's really helps inspire me.
Yeah, definitely. That's a great suggestion, Mark. All right. Any last words, closing thoughts on Kevin's interview?
No, it's terrific. And, Kevin's a great guy. And again, I love the fact that he really holds creativity in a high place. And it's something we can all aspire to.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't have said it better. All right. Well, thank you for listening. Until next time, all the best, health, wealth, and success.
Thanks for listening to this special edition of Enhancing the Human Experience, a World of Creativity with Mark Phillips. If you liked this episode and want to know more, check out gmarkphillips.com and please leave us a review on YouTube, iTunes, or wherever you get your podcasts. See you next time.